Good day, students, and welcome to another lecture on the history of India between 750 CE and 1206 CE, the period that is also known as the early medieval period. Today, we are going to talk about urbanization in India during this period. So, the history of urbanization in early medieval India is an extremely complex matter, and it has provoked vigorous debate among historians. So, if we are to understand this matter comprehensively, then we must go into the details of this debate, and only then can we understand the nature of urban centers in India. So, let us now look at the details of the urbanization debate in early medieval India. To start with, we will look at the opinions of historian R.S. Sharma. Now, historian R.S. Sharma has argued for a two-phase decline in urban centers in India. The first one happened in the 3rd, 4th century CE period, and the second one started after the 6th century CE. He has based his opinions on a huge array of archaeological evidence as well as foreign accounts. According to him, the start of the early medieval period was characterized by a decline of urban centers, a decay in urban crafts and trade, and a migration of artisans to rural areas, and an ensuing blurring of lines between rural and urban centers. As this urban contraction was underway, there was a simultaneous expansion of agriculture. Moreover, he pointed out that temples were taking over markets in various areas, and he considered this to be a sign of the feudalization of trade and commerce. After the 11th century, with the revival of foreign trade, there was a small urban renewal, and by the 14th century, urban expansion was once again happening in India. Now, a very important part of Sharma's argument is the causes of this urban decay. Now, he has assigned 4 major causes: political decline, decay of long distance trade, social upheaval, and the effects of land grants. R.S. Sharma has referred to the works of several historians and archaeologists to argue for the relationship between political decline and urban decline. For example, he has pointed out how the collapse of the Shatavahana power led to urban decline in Gujarat, Rajasthan, and Madhya Pradesh. Historian T. Bloch has attributed the ruin of Vaishali to the collapse of the Gupta Empire. It should, however, be noted in this context that R.S. Sharma dismissed the idea that foreign invasions could cause urban decline. He has shown how archaeological evidence and historical chronology demonstrate that there is no relationship between the Huna invasions or even the later Arab invasions or Turkish invasions of India and urban decline. R.S. Sharma has pointed out that while the power vacuum created by the collapse of powerful political entities like the Gupta, Shatavahana, and Kushan empires could cause urban decline, a direct causal link cannot be drawn. While strong political power means more vigorous trade and an efficient taxation policy, both of which are absolutely vital for towns to grow, he has also admitted that there are periods in Indian history where towns grew and developed without a strong central empire to rule over the entire subcontinent. Rather, Sharma prefers to give more importance to the role of long distance trade. Now, while talking about long distance trade and urbanization, he has made some important points. Firstly, he points out that in the Kushan period, northern and northwestern Indian cities were connected to a huge overland trade network that extended to Central Asia and the eastern parts of the Roman Empire. This meant that cities like Takshila, Takshila in northwestern India or even Mathura had trade ties with places like Uzbekistan and even the trade centers of the Silk Road. And they all simultaneously went through expansion and then decline with the collapse of the Kushanas. Secondly, he argues that the collapse of the Gupta Empire led to a further reduction of Indian foreign trade. Due to the more east central location of the Gupta Empire inside the Indian subcontinent, the northwestern cities could not revive their Kushan era trade anyway. And then, with the collapse of the Guptas, the Roman trade was completely shut down. Now, in Gupta times, the Indo-Roman trade is quite well known, with Roman gold coins, pottery, and other products being located in many Indian trade centers. The famous Roman writer Pliny has calculated that annually Rome shipped 7 tons of gold to India for trade. And the Roman geographer Strabo has argued that 120 ships sailed from the Red Sea to India every year. However, this trade began to decline. Firstly, with the division of the Roman Empire into the Western Empire and the Eastern or Byzantine Empire, and secondly, with the collapse of the Gupta Empire. The urban centers that had thrived by being centers for this Roman trade and the massive artisanal and craft activity that it engendered also began to decline. R.S. Sharma has also not given a lot of importance to Indian trade with Southeast Asia during this period. He has argued that the archaeological evidence is fragmentary and scarce, and therefore this trade could not have been very substantial. Now, while we are discussing these causes of urban decline, we should note that R.S. Sharma has also mentioned the probability of environmental causes in urban decay. He has argued that deforestation, overgrazing, and the reckless expansion of agriculture destroyed the environmental balance, depleted the soil fertility, and exhausted the hinterlands that supported the various cities of India. Sharma has also mentioned the contribution of social upheaval and chaos to the decline of urbanism. He sees social upheaval happen in 2 phases. The first one between the 3rd and 4th century CE, and the second one at around 8th century CE, both coinciding with periods of decline of urbanism. As evidence for this assertion, he cites the Puranas and the Brihat Samhita. For R.S. Sharma, the Indian cities were mainly populated by merchants, artisans, craftsmen, religious and administrative officials, etc. That is, they were different from Western cities in that they had no landowners living in them. Thus, while cities ruled the countryside, they were also dependent on agricultural production for their existence. And hence, in an age of social upheaval and the fracturing of normal processes, urban life could be destabilized. R.S. Sharma ties this argument about social upheaval into his last argument regarding land grants and their effects on cities. According to Sharma, because of this social chaos, towns and their components like shops, markets came to be tied into the land grant system. He cites several texts like Monu or the law books of Narod to show how officials were given towns along with extensive rural land areas as grants. Following Hiuen Tsang and other writers, R.S. Sharma concludes that towns were granted for religious, administrative, and fiscal services, including to temples, monasteries, ministers, military and administrative officers, etc. Sharma argues with numerous examples that granting of urban centers for purposes of maintenance and income of certain groups become even more common as time goes on. Thus, in the 9th century, Shiadoni was granted to the Brahmins of Rayok, and they came to be known as Rayaka Bhattas. According to Sharma, such grants meant that tolls and taxes and other revenues from towns were now redirected to the grantee instead of to the state. According to him, this disrupted normal economic processes, and now the grantee could directly exploit the producers, like artisans and craftsmen, and make them produce specific goods at specific prices. Sharma also cites a huge number of references indicating that merchants themselves were granted land or given management of granted land. According to him, their increasing entanglement in land management meant a consequent decline in their trading activities and their gradual transformation into landowners from important urban residents. Thus, R.S. Sharma has advanced lengthy and elaborate arguments about urban decline in early medieval India. Having covered his arguments, we now turn to another historian who has disagreed with historian R.S. Sharma. Historian Brojodulal Chattopadhyay has considered these arguments and given a different set of opinions. He has rejected R.S. Sharma's idea of a general urban decline. He has admitted that while some areas did see urban decline, there were many urban sites that continued to thrive, and many new urban centers also developed. In fact, it can be said that historian Brojodulal Chattopadhyay tried to restate the entire history of urbanization in early medieval India, and he remarked that the history of urban processes in this period has been inadequately written, as the existing works lack a proper analytical framework. He has argued that for any work to properly discuss urbanization, it needs to properly discuss and analyze the broader urban context, as well as give a definition of what was to be considered urban. Therefore, he has emphasized on methodological and definition issues. However, he has found most of the existing literature to be vague and unreliable as regards to chronology. Starting his own discussion on this subject, historian Brajadulal Chattopadhyay has pointed out that the urbanization of the early medieval period should be classified as the third urbanization in Indian history. The first urbanization was that of the Harappan civilization in ancient India. And the second urbanization started after the 6th century BCE with the development of the Iron Age. This phase, that is the period of the second urbanization, had also seen the development of scripts and coinage, which allowed for expansion of trade. In fact, trade networks and cities were mutually dependent, and the weakening of trade networks and cities in the post-Kushan phase has been remarked upon by many historians. Having defined the early medieval phase to be the age of the third urbanization, Brajadulal Chattopadhyay has asked three crucial questions. What distinguished an urban center in this period? That is, how do we recognize what is an urban center? What factors caused this new phase of urbanization? And how was this urbanization different from earlier phases of urbanization? We must discuss how he has answered these three questions. Brajadulal Chattopadhyay has pointed out that one of the major problems of defining early medieval urban centers is the lack of proper archaeological evidence. Whereas early historical, that is ancient urban centers, had ample literary and archaeological evidence, and thus historians could use one to corroborate the other. This is not so for the early medieval period. Literary sources by themselves are not enough, and due to lack of proper archaeological remains, historians are limited to epigraphic evidence, which can create uncertainty. To eliminate uncertainty and arrive at a clearer picture of what urban centers could be designated as in the early medieval period, historian Chattopadhyay has analyzed various records of land grants and has concluded that if the major object of the grant was about industrial or commercial items, then it was a non-rural and therefore an urban settlement. Moreover, while land grants for rural areas do not specify the settlement structure, urban grants talk about centers of exchange, manufacturing quarters, residences, streets, etc. Thus, having tentatively defined urban centers, Brajadulal Chattopadhyay has gone on to argue that the rise of the new phase of urbanization, sometime after a phase of urban decline, and the increasingly frequent mention of new cities in the 9th century indicate the crystallization of a long-running process that made this new phase of urbanization possible. That is, he has said that since this is a phase of urban advance after a period of decline, it must have been possible due to a lot of factors that were going on for some time. In this context, he has touched upon the extensive works of historian Champakalakshmi about the cities of South India, where the various factors for urbanization have been indicated, such as holding of fairs, trade, commerce, and manufacturing activities, centers of religious importance, centers of administrative importance, etc. Here, Brajadulal Chattopadhyay has agreed that studying these multiple factors can indicate that the cities began to emerge. But he has also gone on to suggest that to truly understand this process of how the cities emerged, the historian also needs to understand what made the simultaneous emergence of all of these factors possible. That is, he has argued that if all of these factors were important for the development of cities, the historian needs to understand why these factors were working at this time. That is, the broader context becomes very important. After surveying a huge number of epigraphs, historian Chattopadhyay came to the conclusion that urban centers in the early medieval period initially developed as centers of trade and exchange, which later acquired sites of manufacture. With these activities growing, state authorities imposed levies and taxes, thus also establishing administrative machinery. And religious sites and officials were incorporated into trade areas from the very start. Thus, urban centers were made viable to the flow and exchange of surplus goods. Chattopadhyay has explained how the cities of early medieval India were distinctive from those of ancient India. He has explained that these ancient cities were centers of political power, had large agricultural hinterlands, and were situated on major trade routes. However, most distinctively, these cities had an epicenter. That is, they were all situated in and operated within the context of the agricultural and commercial operations of the Gangetic plain of North India, which gave them a type of commonality and uniformity as regards cultural items. That is, these cities did not exist only in the context of their hinterlands, but they made up a broader urban region. This, however, was not true for the cities of early medieval India. While they were also situated on trade routes and connected to networks of exchange, these trade routes were neither as regular nor as long-ranged as those of the ancient period. Their urban context was more regional, and they were dependent on their local hinterlands. A huge number of urban centers did develop in the early medieval period. However, they merely functioned as major nodes in local networks of exchange, and thus became very important in regional configurations of trade and commerce, rather than forming a huge interregional urban region like in ancient India. Thus, the cities of the early medieval period were more localized than those of the ancient period. So, these were the arguments of historian Brajadulal Chattopadhyay. But his was not the last word on the matter. Historian Ranobir Chakraborty has also refuted the theories of urban decline in early medieval India. He has pointed out a major contradiction in Marxist historiography of Indian urban processes. It was argued that the use of iron and the consequent urban expansion in the 6th century BCE gave rise to circumstances that made the second phase of urbanization possible. And yet, the same school of historians indicate the expansion of agriculture in the early medieval period as a major factor of urban decay. Therefore, this is a contradiction. Having indicated this problem with existing historiography, he has examined archaeological and epigraphic evidences for urbanization. Historian Ranobir Chakraborty has pointed out how recently archaeologists have been able to identify streets, markets, houses, temples, and administrative centers in early medieval towns. He has also shown how, apart from being centers of exchange, towns were also administrative and military centers and could sometimes emerge from the rural region through performing trade functions like the mandapikas, about which we have already heard while discussing interregional trade. Ranobir Chakraborty has argued that Indian towns were not dependent solely on foreign or long-distance trade for their existence. Thus, while there was some urban decay between 300 to 900 CE, there was also considerable urban development after that. Economic activities like trade or manufacturing, political activities like revenue collection and administration, and cultural activities like being centers of religion and pilgrimage gave early medieval towns their distinctiveness. These cities were scattered all over India and were strongly dependent on local routes for their growth. In this respect, Ranobir Chakraborty has agreed with historian Brojodulal Chattopadhyay. Agrarian expansion and increased temple building for the vigorous bhakti cults fed the growth of towns, and the mobilization of resources for trade only increased this. Thus, Ranobir Chakraborty has concluded that early medieval India had flourishing urban growth. So now that we have heard the opinions of various historians regarding urbanization in early medieval India, we must come to our own conclusion. It can be seen with the detailed analysis of epigraphic and literary evidence done by historians like Brojodulal Chattopadhyay that the arguments of R.S. Sharma for a general urban decline can now be rejected. Instead, it needs to be understood that the early medieval period formed its own distinctive period of urbanization with its own unique features. It should also, however, be noted that trade, commerce, and finance were definitely not collapsing in this period. Indian traders were happily conducting foreign trade and were linked to a huge Indian Ocean trade network that stretched from Egypt to Arabia, to Persia, to Southeast Asia, and even to China. Arab traders were visiting India regularly, and Indians were trading in places like Aden and Hormuz from their own ports of Cambay, Calicut, etc. There was also a rich internal trade network maintained by large trade centers like Pattanas, intermediate trade centers like the Mandapikas, and the small trade centers like the Hattas. Merchants were not just traders, they often held important administrative posts and were the authors of philosophical and poetic works. Thus, it can be understood that the early medieval period was a time of rich economic activity that complemented and encouraged the vigorous processes of urbanization. Thank you.